Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Welcome to everyone who's in the audience, out there in virtual land. My name is Kylie Madhav, and I will be your moderator this evening. Again, many thanks to everyone for making this call on a rather cold Wednesday night in New York City. So, as I mentioned, my name is Kylie Madhav, and I will be moderating our very lively discussion tonight. For those of us who are based in New York City, you all know that we are less than 3 weeks away from our closely followed mayoral general election. As per the New York City Campaign Finance Board, thus far in the race, at least $88,813,105 have been spent by the candidates, campaigns, and the various political action committees that support or oppose those campaigns. In 2017, during the mayoral race, the total spent on all races was $20,417,321. 8 years prior, in 2009, the total spent during the mayoral campaign for all candidates was $10,723,137. Of course, that is if we exclude the $108 million of personal wealth and private contributions that the former Mayor Bloomberg spent on his own candidacy. Running a mayoral campaign in New York City has never been particularly affordable, but given the incredible and increasing amounts of money being spent on local, state, and federal races in this country, where wages for the average worker have stagnated for nearly half a century. Pardon me. For nearly half a century, we have to ask ourselves if quote unquote big money in politics is changing the nature of the relationship between the political class and the people. We want tonight's webinar to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, please do submit them in the chat at any time during our conversation. Of course, if you prefer to ask them live, one-on-one, then you can do that at the end of our conversation as well. We will address all questions asked in the chat and, of course, in face-to-face during the Q&A portion of our program at the end of the call. All sources cited during our discussion will be sent to those who registered using the email that they provided during registration. Given the timeliness of this discussion, we've reached out to the campaigns of all candidates currently in the running to become the next mayor of New York to participate in this webinar. None took us up on our offer. To help us better understand what money in politics means for our city and for what remains of our democracy, tonight we'll hear from two distinguished panelists with decades of experience in campaign finance reform and political reporting. Greg Coleridge is a longtime pro-democratic and human rights advocate and co-director of Move to Amend, a national coalition seeking to enact a constitutional amendment that seeks to abolish corporate constitutional rights. His most recent book, entitled The Depth of Change: Selected Writings and Remarks on Social Change, is a compilation of columns, editorials, and sermons focused on domestic and international movements for social justice and systemic change. Meghnad Bose is an award-winning investigative journalist with over 10 years of experience as a reporter and editor. He currently teaches journalism and heads the MA program in open source investigative reporting at the University of Memphis. He has reported extensively on the New York City Mayoral Race, the Gazan genocide, and discriminatory immigration policing, both in the US and India, for publications including The Intercept, Dropsite News, and The Quint. Please join me in giving a virtual welcome to Meghnad Bose and Greg Coleridge. And so, to get our conversation started this evening, I thought it might make sense if we begin our talk with a sense of how we got to where we are with regards to money in politics, and what exactly does quote unquote big money even mean? I've already mentioned the substantial amounts of money being spent on this mayoral race, but my question is, has there ever been a time in American politics when the amount of money that could be spent on a race was limited by law or custom? If so, what's changed? Greg, this feels like something that might be more under sort of your domain of experience, and so I thought you might start us off on this topic.
Well, sure. Thanks so much, Kylie, and good to be with you and Megnod and everyone who has joined. Appreciate the participation of all of you. Yeah, well, money has always had an influence in elections. It's been tempered, relatively speaking. It is relative, of course, because our democracy is relative from the very get-go. We, the people, have never been all the people, and there have always been anti-democratic elements of our Constitution and our governance. But elections have at times been, relatively speaking, more democratic than they have been at other times. Money has been a contributing factor to making it difficult for the voices of people who don't have money to have their voices heard, their needs met, their communities helped. Historically, there have been instances and laws, you talk about law and custom, going back as far back as the mid 19th century. There have been efforts, beginning first with the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, a law that prohibited civil service employees from being solicited for political contributions. And this was triggered, no pun intended, but triggered by the assassination of President James Garfield by a disgruntled office seeker. We've had the Tillman Act during the Teddy Roosevelt administration that banned corporate and national bank contributions to federal candidates. It was a good law, but it wasn't really enforced. There have been laws that have prohibited public utility companies from making public contributions. Maybe some of you have heard that about the Hatch Act because it's in the news again, of course, even though it goes back to the late 1930s that banned federal employees from contributing to federal election campaigns. In the early 70s, there was something called the Federal Election Campaign Act that provided for the first time really broad disclosure of campaign contributions or donations, depending on how you want to look at it, or investments, depending on how you want to look at it, and limited spending on media advertising. It also established at that time something called political action committees or PACs, which, if you're not aware of what those are, they're just basically organizations that pool campaign contributions from various members connected to an organization, whether that organization is a corporation, a union, a nonprofit like Planned Parenthood or the NRA. So that was a reform to this 1971, what was called Federal Election Campaign Act. An amendment to that established mandatory limits on contributions and campaign spending. Then there was, I'm sure people have heard about what's known as the McCain-Feingold Act, passed in the early 2000s, that sought banning soft money, which is large, unregulated contributions made to political parties. And they tried to regulate electioneering communications. So those were efforts to try to rein in, relatively speaking, big money in elections. But you ask what changed? Well, basically, the powers to be and those who wanted to hijack, if you will, the ability of people to have their voices heard decided to forget trying to enact or reenact or unact or refuse laws. They went right to the Supreme Court. And so various Supreme Court decisions have, over the last 50 years, overturned campaign finance laws, four of them to be exact. First one being a major note, first one being the 1976, what was called Buckley versus Valeo decision, the very first time that money was equated as free speech. Second was First National Bank versus Bellotti 2 years later in 1978. And this was not the first time, well, it was the first time that corporate entities were given First Amendment free speech rights. Corporate entities had long before that, going back to the 1880s, acquired never intended constitutional rights in many other ways, in hijacking many other amendments. But the 78 decision, First National Bank versus Bellotti, was the first time they were allowed to weigh in and give money or invest money in, at that time, not political campaigns so much as ballot initiatives. Third, you had what I'm sure everyone has heard, the Citizens United versus Federal Elections Committee in 2010 that struck down the McCain-Feingold laws and basically concluded that independent spending could not corrupt candidates. Go figure. They said that and determined that, I swear, with a straight face. And lastly was the Speech Now organization versus FEC. That was also passed. It's not well known, but that was passed just several months after Citizens United. And what's important about that decision in July of 2010, as opposed to Citizens United in January 2010, is that it said, well, if independent spending could not corrupt candidates, then obviously corruption, contributions to groups that only make independent expenditures also could not be corrupting. Again, issued with a straight face. And so what this initiated and launched was what we know of today as super PACs, which are organizations that raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, from unions, from associations, and from individuals, and then can spend those unlimited sums. Again, they can't spend or raise money directly to candidate campaigns, instead from things that are called independent, quote unquote. And by independent, it means they're not supposed to be coordinated with political campaigns. Well, right. Anyway, those are the four major decisions that have basically reversed what minimal limitations there were.
Thank you so much for this incredibly in-depth overview, Greg. And, I think now that you've mentioned, so it sounds like the aberration is actually our current moment. It sounds like throughout most of American history, there have been clearly demarcated limits on how much could be spent on political candidates, and that, large sums of money in politics, it was understood to be I guess, a corrupting influence by people who were actually in power. And so, that it sounds like that changed a lot beginning of the 2010s and earlier to a certain extent, as you were mentioning. But I'm wondering as well, and maybe Magnot as well, like you could contribute some color on this question. So we know now that the floodgates have been opened, right? And there's essentially, it sounds like there are a few limits on how much money can go into a particular person's political campaign, depending on the source. But can you all tell us a bit more about how money flows within political parties? So we've heard the two, but what happens once it gets there? How does it circulate within the party? And yeah, and like, what does that mean for the rest of us? Meghna, like, do you want to like jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, look, and first of all, thank you to both of you for having me here. Um, I can speak to this with some examples, right? You look at, we're discussing the New York City mayoral primary, right? Um, the first phase, important phase of this election was the Democratic primary, right? New York is a deep blue city. And we already saw in the Democratic primary, which was basically, I mean, the primaries exist so that there is inner party democracy, and the members or the supporters of a party can choose who they want on their ticket, right, on their party ticket. And we saw millions and millions of dollars being spent not just by the campaigns themselves, which one would argue is fair, especially because in the New York City mayoral race, you get something called matching funds, right? So these are funds designed to create a level playing field between different candidates. And so if you get a certain amount of contribution, you can get as many as 8 times of that amount in matching funds from the city. But that is only the money that can be spent by the candidates. And like Greg mentioned, that doesn't include the money spent by the super PACs and the political action committees, which are operating outside. So, how these super PACs exert their influence, to answer your question, Kylie, is that they're essentially often at the federal sort of federal election level, or the House rep election, Senate elections. There are also donations given to the party concerned, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, right? And a candidate that can draw in more money from the for the party is essentially inherently seen as a more beneficial candidate for the party, right? So you see how even the inner party democracy, which is the primary process, therefore, in a way, gets corrupted by the influence of big money. And I've got some data that to show, to present for this particular election, but maybe we can get to that in a question that comes up shortly.
And sounds fantastic. And thank you so much for that, Megnod. And you both have mentioned Citizens United and sort of like the super PACs that were created essentially like in the wake of that decision beginning in 2010. And it comes to my mind, I think it was in October 2023, the Brookings Institution released a report on Democratic backsliding. And this actual report that came out 2 years ago cited 2010 as the beginning of a period of sort of accelerated erosion of democratic institutions within the United States, and and policies that had previously been meant to protect the electorate also being like walked back. And of course, we all know that correlation does not prove causation. But firstly, I'm wondering, and I think I know your answer, Meghnad, like I think that you mentioned it to a certain extent just now, but one, I'd like to know, do you all believe that we've seen a weakening of democratic institutions in the period since Citizens United in 2010? And if so, do you believe that it's connected to how much money is able to be contributed to political campaigns and parties these days? And if so, what's the connection?
Greg, do you want to go first?
Well, the answer is pretty short, which is, yeah, there's a connection. Although let's be, crystal clear that we hardly had any kind of democratic nirvana before Citizens United. One can just go back. I mean, there are lots of examples. One of which, my favorite, famous or infamous, is the bailout of the banks by bailout of the Wall Street banks by the federal government. That $700 billion bailout, which was originally 2 pages, that it got pulled back after incredible amount of opposition. But remember, that was a result of the financial institutions of Wall Street, centered in New York, by the way, that basically pulled every kind of political lever imaginable. When did that happen? That was several years before Citizens United. So yes, things may have been worsened, no question about it. It's a matter though of degree than of kind, because the voice of people. I mean, just think, did we have prior to Citizens United? I don't know, healthcare for all? How about an environment in which the fossil fuel corporations were not determining healthcare, or a clean environment, a livable world? How about a foreign policy that was not really influenced by the military industrial complex and the like. So, it is all relative. It is bad now. It is worse now, but we hardly had a paradise democratic beforehand.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is that what are the levers that citizens have in exercising sort of political influence, right? Um, Greg spoke about lobbying and say, for example, the healthcare lobby or the military industrial complex lobby trying to get policies and politics in their favor. But ultimately, in a democracy, the fundamental power that citizens have is to cast their ballot, right? And so if you disagree with a member of Congress or a political party that is siding, say, with big pharma, and you want to register your dissent, one of the ways to do that is to cast your vote. And so that, like a lot of those other problems, they're huge problems in their own right. And this is not to take away from Greg's point that we didn't have a nirvana even earlier. But that fundamental power that citizens have to reject politics of a certain kind that they don't agree with is during elections. And when we come to unlimited political expenditures and election funding and election expenses, what that does is that corrupts even that fundamental power that citizens have. Because we live in a sea of information, with information coming at us on all fronts, not just in conventional mainstream media, but also on social media, online, on the internet, offline, through like banner ads that you see, hoardings that you see, flyers that are distributed in your apartment complex, or where you're living. Now, all of that gets impacted by how much money a candidate has going for them in an electoral race. So even if you say have a candidate who is against big pharma, or who is providing a principled position against this sort of um, against being compromised to the military industrial complex, that candidate will find it so much harder if they are being outspent by a multiple of 20, 50, 100,000, right? Um, And so the Citizens United judgment, being that latest blow to like the level playing field, or even the attempts to a level playing field that candidates could have, not just impacted this whole sort of campaign for freer and fairer elections, but also impacted advocacy for all those other issues that Greg was
Mhm.
mentioning.
And so that makes in total sense. And I suppose that sort of brings us to the crux of tonight's discussion, which is indeed the NYC mayoral race currently ongoing and very much heating up and about to reach its conclusion in 3 weeks. And so you all have given us a very brilliant, very in-depth overview of campaign finance or the lack of campaign finance reform in this country, the urgency around it, sort of like what the history of it has been and how it affects essentially how the voices of the people are articulated to those who govern across the country. And so I suppose I'd love to talk like a bit about our home city, New York. What does this mean for New York? And from what you've noticed this election cycle, are there any wealthy persons or corporations seeking to use their dollars to influence the outcome of this election? Megnat, I feel like you probably have an answer raring to go.
Thank you, Kylie. I love how neutral you sort of set that up. That are there any? Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. But can you all see my screen right now? Okay. Yeah. So the one thing that I wanted to start with is that in any election cycle, you'll see headlines all over your news feed, your social media about campaign finance, right? You must have seen these headlines. You may have seen these headlines. Cuomo losing more than $600,000 over concerns of super PAC coordination, or super PAC like Fix the City becoming the single largest outside spending force in New York City's political history. But how do these headlines and these news stories and this data actually impact an election? So, to understand that, let's actually go through a couple of important points. One is, which Greg touched upon earlier, what are the types of funding that are available for a political campaign, for an election campaign? The fundamentally two types of funding, right? One is the campaign's own funds. So Andrew Cuomo's campaign has a certain amount of funds. Zoran Mamdani's campaign has a certain amount of funds. Now, in New York City, like I said, that there is a rule for matching funds that is designed to benefit to create a level playing field or attempt to create a level playing field. What it does is that if you get a certain amount of funds from an individual donor, New York City, up to a certain amount, will match those funds by giving you several multiples of that fund, of that amount of contribution. That's one type of funds that are available to the candidates. Now, the second type, which is often the larger pool of money, is funds that are labeled as independent expenditures. Now, independent expenditures include funding from PACs and super PACs, political action committees. Super PACs, like Greg mentioned, have no limit on how much money they can pour into their sort of campaign. The only catch being that the candidates cannot engage with their super PACs on anything. So Fix the City, which is a large super PAC, the largest super PAC in this mayoral election, it is a pro Andrew Cuomo, anti Zoran Mamdani super PAC. Officially, Andrew Cuomo cannot engage with Fix the City or any of the super PACs supporting him. How is this enforced? Trust me, bro. That meme is literally how this this policy of no coordination between the campaigns and their super PACs is run, right? Now imagine this is basically the candidate saying, I won't coordinate with a super PAC spending millions of dollars to support me. Is somebody watching whether those running the super PACs or individuals involved or close to the super PACs are having meetings with the candidates as part of associations they may represent, industry groups they may represent, pressure groups and influence groups they may represent? Not really. Despite that very low bar on vigilance, I want to go back to the previous slide and show you, despite that very low bar on vigilance, Andrew Cuomo, one of the top two contenders for New York City's mayoral post, has been fined more than $1 million for alleged collusion with super PACs aiding him, right? And now let's come to the actual money. How much money are we talking about here? Um, in the 2025 NYC mayoral election so far, this is data updated till yesterday. The campaign spending has been $55 million. Independent spending has been $33 million. Now remember, of this $55 million being spent by Mamdani, Cuomo, and the others, there were lots of candidates in the primary, right? Plus, there are other candidates like Curtis Sliwa, the Republican nominee, Eric Adams, the independent candidate who recently dropped out, current mayor of New York City. But out of the campaign expenses, Zoran Mamdani's campaign has spent $10.7 million so far. Andrew Cuomo's campaign has spent $8.9 million. This is that first bucket that we were talking about. Now, the next slide is where it gets really interesting. This is the role of outside money or the independent expenditures that I was talking about, the second pool. In that pool, and this is an analysis that we've done that I did from data provided by the New York City Campaign Finance Board, donations, contributions that were for Zoran Mamdani and against Cuomo totaled a paltry $2.7 million. And I say paltry because it's compared to the amount of money spent against Mamdani and for Cuomo. $29.1 million out of $33 million of independent expenditures have gone to funding, supporting Andrew Cuomo and opposing Zoran Mamdani in this mayoral election. Out of that 33 million, and now let's stack it up. Let's stack up the two pools we were talking about, and you can see just 2 slides back, we showed you how much more of a level playing field it was due to the matching funds by New York City, etc. You can see that there's a relative degree of equality between 10.5 million and 9 million. But when you combine outside expenditure, Zoran Mamdani's total is just 13.5 million versus Andrew Cuomo's $38 million in this race. Out of that independent expenditure, 23.5 million has come from one group called Fix the City. This is a group that has had billionaire donors. This is a group that has had donors such as DoorDash, companies such as DoorDash, with clear vested interests in seeing Andrew Cuomo win. They have spent $24 million on this election. That is more than the total campaign expenditures of the Mamdani campaign and the Cuomo campaign combined. This is what we're talking in terms of the influence of outside money. Kylie?
I mean, this is incredible. So thank you so much for coming like with receipts, like when it comes to big money in the mayoral race. But so you've shared some startling figures, right? You know, the amount of outside money that has gone or that has flowed into the campaign. I would argue pretty obviously trying to sway the election in one way or another. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about what you know about where that money is coming from. You and Greg, like, what have you heard? What's out there? You know, I've heard whispers of DoorDash being pretty heavily interested in the outcome of this election, which is remarkable because New York City is about 3,000 miles away from DoorDash headquarters in San Francisco. So, you know, if we use them as an example, what is the San Francisco-based food delivery app? What is their stake in who is mayor of New York City?
Greg, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead. You are the pro on understanding this. and the sources of the money. I'll just say, I thought it was interesting the name of that super PAC, Fix the City, because oftentimes we think, look, our political system isn't broken, but rather it's fixed, as in rigged. And so it seems appropriate that that name would be Fix, as in fixed. It is. They're just being very transparent. Talk about transparency. There you go.
Touche.
No, Kylie, I mean, to answer your question, look, these companies have clear interests in a city like New York. Let's look at DoorDash. Couple of things. DoorDash has been lobbying to be allowed to charge restaurants higher fees, right? If you are one of the biggest donors to the man who ends up becoming New York City mayor, are you telling me that that person will not be indebted to you for your role in their victory? Right? And so if there is this one item on their agenda out of like, or two items or three items on their agenda, which they really want the incoming mayor's support on, if they've bankrolled the mayor's path to City Hall, you can bet that the mayor will feel a large amount of pressure to cave into those two or three points of agenda. And often these aren't very populist measures or measures that directly seem to impact large numbers of people. I mean, if you ask a regular New Yorker, hey, do you mind if DoorDash gets to charge restaurants a wee bit more on their deliveries? Uh, People might not be like people are, I don't care. I mean, who knows, right? Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, right? But for DoorDash, that could mean millions and millions of dollars in additional revenue, right? And so you have business interests with a clear cut agenda who are pushing their agenda while bankrolling a super PAC that is designed to help Andrew Cuomo come to power in this instance. Um, and I can share an example. So if those who are joining the webinar are wondering, okay, if this is how this money is being spent by these super PACs, how can we find out about it? And I can give like, let me just share my screen and give one simple tip. When you notice an ad that you're watching on your TV, on YouTube. You'll be bombarded with YouTube ads now as the election approaches. You can't start a single video unless you've got YouTube Premium without one of these campaign ads. Notice very carefully towards the end of the ad, you'll notice this text at the bottom. So this, by the way, is an attack ad against Zoran Mamdani on which millions and millions of dollars, I think $5.5 million, if I'm not mistaken, has been spent just on putting this ad on the airwaves and distributing this ad. Towards the end of the ad, very small, illegible, deliberately illegible text will be this message. I zoomed it in for you on the next slide. It will say, paid for by Fix the City, Inc. The top three donors to this organization responsible for this advertisement are DoorDash, Matthew Hulsizer, and John Fish. And there you have it, right? There are rules that expressly require ads to say where the money is coming from. It's almost always ignored. When you're watching this on TV, when you're watching this on YouTube, it will not be like the usual course of things to sort of pause the ad 2 seconds before it ends, zoom into that illegible text, and make out that, hey, it's this food service delivery company that is actually spending millions and millions of dollars into getting these attack ads published. But New York City's campaign finance board actually has a section called Follow the Money, where they put all these details out. So this is on the New York City Campaign Finance Board's website. It'll say the name of the spender. The communication is called risky ad because the ad is titled Zoran Mamdani risky. The type, which is video, this was for TV and cable audiences. The distribution date, the total cost, $5.4 million was spent in just putting this ad, labeling Zoran Mamdani as dangerous for the city as on your screens, and you can see that it's officially an opposition ad to Zoran Mamdani, and the amount spent has been $5.3 million. So if you're looking to stay aware on where these ads are coming from, who's funding these ads, the New York City Campaign Finance Board website is a great resource. But unfortunately, Kylie, Greg, we know that that's not something regular voters will end up doing, and they're likely to just instead be influenced by the ads themselves, often which are very provocative, inflammatory, and designed to provoke you into feeling these very strong, sharp sentiments.
There's also a
100%.
lag time when these reports need to be filed and information needs to be given. And so sometimes the major amount of money that comes in near the end of the campaign won't be reported until guess when? After the campaign. Just today, for example, right? Within several hours ago, who's the guy? Bill Ackman is his name, a huge hedge fund manager, a close confidant and funder of the Trump campaign, just forked over what, $1 million. So if that had not made, major news, people wouldn't even know about it until after the campaign.
Truly incredible stuff. And so, I mean, so it sounds like if people are willing, if, well, people or mysterious organizations are willing to spend millions of dollars on a single TV advertisement, presumably it's because they believe it will result in a certain outcome in the election. Presumably that the candidate that they're advocating against will lose and the one they're advocating for will win, right? Pretty straightforward. And yet, in this past Democratic primary in June of this year in New York City, Mamdani, who you just showed was outspent by an order or has been outspent thus far by a factor of 10 in terms of outside money. And like that is opposing his campaign, he beat Cuomo by 13 percentage points in this past Democratic primary. So there's not perhaps a one-to-one correlation between the amount of money spent and electoral outcomes, which I would say is probably a good thing for all of us. But what do you think would have made the difference, right? Given how much money's in this campaign, what do you think has made the difference for the Mamdani campaign that apparently is at such a disadvantage with respect to outside funding? Why have they been able to overcome this formidable hurdle? And Meghna, I think you mentioned something about matching funds a few minutes ago. Did those play a role, or what factors do the two of you think have been his secret sauce, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I can take that first. The thing is that look, Zoran Mamdani ran a campaign that was historic on several fronts. One of the reasons it was historic was because the campaign had close to 50,000, around 50,000 volunteers, and he ended up winning 400,000 odd votes in the primary. That's that's 8 votes to every volunteer. Like that's eight voters for every volunteer in a campaign. That, I mean, that in itself is historic, right? The ground game needed. But look at the amount of ground game that was needed, the amount of popularity that was needed to overcome a candidate being bankrolled by millions and millions of dollars from big donors and wealthy corporations, right? And billionaires, right? And and so the other thing I'll say is that when we talk of Andrew Cuomo, and you were saying that, like, presumably there might be some influence that is exerted on a potential Cuomo mayoralty. Andrew Cuomo was asked about this in a recent interview that, hey, a lot of your donors are actually donors for Donald Trump as well. So what's what connects you and Donald Trump? Like, why do you have the same donors? And he said, oh, because maybe they know, like we know the same people. That these same people may know Trump, he's a New Yorker, and they know me. Now, what was left unsaid in his interview, which in his response was that, so what? They
Yeah,
know you and they're funding millions for you. You're admitting that they have effectively aligned to you because you know them and they know you. And you're still going to expect us to believe that that will have absolutely no impact or no influence on how you look at things, how you look at issues, right? Um, and you look at the some of the billionaires who funded this. I mean, Greg mentioned Bill Ackman, who's just come out with another $1 million donation $1 million gift to this Cuomo campaign. But also there is John B. Hess, a billionaire oil executive, who donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration in 2017 and has donated $500,000 to fix the city. Ronald Lauder, the billionaire heir to Estee Lauder, gave
Hmm.
$750,000 to Cuomo's super PAC. The heiress of Walmart, Alice Walton, from the Walton family that owns the Walmart company, gave $100,000 to Cuomo's super PAC in August, gave another $100,000 to Cuomo's super PAC in April. She's also bankrolled Republicans like Greg Abbott in the past, right? So
Hmm.
you look at essentially at times the political funding, election expenses from big donors and big corporations is inherently bipartisan because these corporations want what they want, and the people in their way or on their path are politicians. Now, whether they're Democrat or they're Republican, the one way to ensure they have a seat at the table, they have an ear of the candidate, of the successful candidate, is to pump millions of dollars into getting them elected in the first place so that they're indebted, so that they're grateful, so that they know that without their money, maybe the next time an election comes around, without that support, they might not be able to win.
You asked what is it that made the Mamdani campaign so successful, and obviously it's the movement. Either, I mean, we're talking about power, right? That's what governs decision making in this country. And I mean, it's an oversimplification, but clearly, either have to have organized people or organized money. If you don't have the one, you sure as heck better have the other. And I know there are a number of people on this call who are grassroots activists that know full well and have been no doubt active in the local scene, that it's a whole heck of a lot easier to get people who do not have money to be elected at a local level, because you can offset money by going door to door, by pressing the flesh, by developing relationships, the candidate, him or her, or themselves, or surrogates, volunteers. And so that is very important. And so to the degree that people, and same with ballot initiatives, right? There's all these ballot initiatives that a lot easier to get them passed at a municipal level. When you start going up or down the political level to the state and federal, depending, again, if you look at it as going up or down, it's a lot harder, because then it's just so difficult unless you have a gigantic mass movement, which happens sometimes. But that's what it takes, organized people. And that's where having allies from organizations are so important, whether it's labor organizations or issue organizations concerned about the environment, or young people, or healthcare, or whatever those movements and efforts may be. To have individuals who are behind you that can help by communicating person to person can offset that $1, one vote reality that is corrupting the political process.
So people power indeed being something of like an antidote to the scourge of big money in politics. It sounds like that's a really powerful example. Thank you all for sharing that. But I guess on the flip side, are there any recent elections, be they in New York State, be they elsewhere, where indeed you would argue that we did see big money able to sway the outcome of that election? And I'm wondering if we might want to bring the question of lobbyists at this point, because I know that people before they heard of super PACs in the last decade, they probably heard of lobbyists way back when. And what role do they play in the political money machine? And where have we seen big money essentially able to get their person in office?
Yeah, I mean, look, in Missouri recently, last year, APAC, which is the pro-Israel lobbying group in the United States, they claimed credit for Cory Bush's Missouri primary defeat. Um, and they had put more than $8 million into a primary to help beat Cory Bush. We saw in New York State, we saw Jamal Bowman lose his race also after huge money was thrown against him, also by certain pro-Israel interest groups. And I mean, the pro-Israel interest group is just one of many lobbies that seek to exert political control by just putting in obscene amounts of money that make sure that the candidate who's opposing you barely gets any coverage in terms of ad space, right? Versus what you'll get in the newspapers, on the radio stations, on the TV channels, on social media, on YouTube. Now, when we come to just to go back slightly to your Zora and Mamdani question, Kylie, the interesting thing was that a lot of people credited Mamdani's outreach on social media. But let's bring in an interesting factor here to discuss. The social media algorithms aren't neutral either.
Mm,
And now, right now, we're seeing TikTok on the verge of being acquired by a group that has very decidedly conservative interests, including pro-Israel interests, right? And so, would you be surprised if tomorrow a candidate that sort of opposes these groups and their interests
mm.
isn't featured on the algorithm just as much, thereby taking away even that so far that great leveler of sorts in social media, that okay, Cuomo, say for example, can spend millions of dollars in getting Instagram ads and YouTube ads to people, but if his opponent creates a truly viral video with campaign messaging that resonates with people, maybe people share it enough for it to go viral and reach as many people, as many voters as are needed to. But even there, the social media algorithms at play and the billionaires who own them could just become yet another way of how billionaires impact how we consume our politics.
Really incredible. And so, with that being said, how do we get out of this, right? So it sounds like we in America are pretty deep in the lurch, in the sunken place when it comes to campaign finance reform. So absolutely no pressure, but in 3 sentences or less, how do we save American democracy? 30 seconds, go. And don't worry, the fate of the republic is on your shoulders. It's no big deal.
Greg?
Well, as many people on this call may know, Move to Amend is a, a main supporter of what's called the We the People Amendment, which would, um, if passed, abolish these twin constitutional doctrines of money equaling free speech and a corporation being a person. So this would transcend. It would certainly get rid of Citizens United, but we can get rid of Citizens United tomorrow morning, but money would still be equal to free speech, and corporate entities would still be involved in lots of ways to corrupt the political process via elections, but many other ways. So that's one. Individuals can approach their candidates running for office at every level of elections and ask them to take our what's called pledge to amend. And I'll put the link in the chat, or I can maybe Alfonso can put it in the chat. So that tries to get candidates to come on board and say, yeah, I'm willing to, if elected, do what I can to promote this. Third, there is, I would think, in New York City or wherever people are at, opportunities at the local level to where your city may have public access, radio or television, community TV station. Why not try to pressure them to provide a certain amount of you know mandatory, get something to force them to mandate, to pass a local ordinance to say that prior to every election there will be a certain amount of time devoted to candidates running for office. And lastly, it's been spoken about, but enhanced disclosure requirements, as mentioned before, doesn't do us much good if we find out how much money has been, invested in a campaign after the fact. So trying to get reporting done in a timely way, not just reported, but then turned around. So you want to make sure. And these days it's easy to do. We're not talking about in the past where you submitted paper reports that had to be hand translated. Now it's all electronic. So there's no reason that when a form is turned in on Wednesday, it can't be made public by Thursday. So those would be four things.
Yeah, I mean, I've got three. One is greater election literacy, right? We talk a lot about media literacy. We need election literacy, which is for people to understand how their elections work, what are the factors that are impacting the elections, how big money works, right? So, election literacy, greater awareness on this front, advocacy about the impact of big money by advocates, yes, but also by political groups and by candidates themselves. And especially here, to put a focus on candidates who are in safe seats. Now, look, every time, every 4 years, when the presidential election comes around, we say, oh, there are a handful of swing states that determine the future of the country every 4 years. But there are lots of states where there are lots of safe seats. So safe blue seats, safe red seats, right? Candidates in those constituencies can make are better positioned to make often a greater pitch about the impact of how big money is impacting all of us and all our elections across the country, right? So greater awareness, greater advocacy, not just by political groups, but also by candidates, especially those in safe seats. Finally, more reporting by journalists. Journalists should be tracking campaign finance like hawks, right? If another $1 billion has been poured in by a billionaire or by a large corporation, wait, what's their agenda? Why are they doing it? What do they expect from this mayoral candidate if they actually win their way to City Hall? And lastly, organic outreach by
Hmm.
candidates that don't depend on billionaire funded routes of reaching people, right? Now, this could mean a greater ground game, like we saw in the primaries with the Mamdani campaign. It could also mean going through social media, and when social media gets more corrupted, maybe beyond social media, right? It could be newsletters, it could be reaching out via mailers, figuring out ways to reach people through routes that aren't immensely compromised by billionaire money. And those, I think, I mean, I know these are lofty goals, but these are goals essentially to protect and preserve that very sacred right of the citizen, which is to be the strongest stakeholder or the direct stakeholder in determining who rules them.
So before we open it up for questions, I do have one lightning round question. I've got to ask you all. We just said 88 million, give or take a few hundred thousand, has been spent thus far in the mayoral campaign. So I have to ask you, with the last 3 weeks, what figure do you think that we're going to get to in terms of the amount of money spent? I'm not taking bets on it because that would, be a little too on the nose for our political moment.
I'll
But
take the over.
over,
I'll take the over, whatever
Whatever the bet.
whatever number is suggested. I'll take the over.
Price is Right indeed. Megna, like, what are you saying? Like, so we're at 88 million. How high do you think it's going to get?
I mean, look, this race is getting closer, at least according to the polls, especially with Eric Adams dropping out. Who knows if Curtis Sliwa goes soft in the final fortnight of this election cycle? That might be another bump for Andrew Cuomo, and the race might get even more competitive, which would necessitate more money being thrown at the race. And I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, don't quote me on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if we cross $100 million by the time election day comes around.
You just like
$1
to hope that people, that there'll be a backlash. At some point, there is a law of diminishing returns, right? People get the mailer and it said, oh, there's propaganda. They get the ad that's an attack ad. Oh, I don't believe that. They have to be careful in how they do things because at some point people do turn off. And that's, in a sense, it's a vicious cycle why they have to keep advertising, advertising, advertising because people have become sort of, mentally, psychologically paralyzed and tuned out to a lot of it because it's so negative and not truthful.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, look,
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't work.
former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, spent what, more than $1 billion on a 4 month presidential campaign. Where did that get him? Nowhere, right? Like barely scratched the surface
Yeah,
in the polls, right? And had to drop out. So it's not always the case that
that's
big
right.
money can just buy your way to victory, but far too often it exercises a disproportionate role. And one would hope that, like you say, Greg, people also start becoming more attuned to it, more aware about it, and then say, okay, if I'm getting bombarded with ads from this one candidate, maybe let me find out who the others are in the field, what their agendas are.
Yeah, yeah, right.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you both immensely for your input tonight. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation for myself, and I'm sure for everyone in our audience tonight. So, without further ado, Alfonso, do we have any questions from the chat? And anyone who's on the call, you are free to unmute yourself and ask any question as well if you'd like.
Yes, we don't have any questions yet, but people can unmute yourself and ask a question. Let me make sure everybody can do that. Yep. All right, so everyone should be able to unmute yourself in case you have a question.
Or comment.
Or comment.
Or, indeed.
The one advice I've got as a new professor is that when we go to questions, to just give it some time to germinate as people, because in the first few seconds it's like you'll barely see any questions, and then sometimes, more often than not, a few seconds later one hand goes up and the first question comes our way. So
And this is quite a bit to process. I feel like for most people, it's like, knowing just how much money is flowing like within our political system and, from the few people that it's coming from, it's an eye opener, I think, for a lot of people. Looks like there is, do I see a question there? Alfonso, did you get that as well, or is that just in my,
Uh, I don't see it. Probably wasn't directly to you.
oh, interesting. I think it was okay, I think I might
Oh,
actually,
from
okay.
Marianne?
No, I have a question about what do you think we can do to get more people to vote? So very germane to this conversation. Yeah, like right, and I think this speaks to Greg, like what you were saying in terms of, there might come a point where people are so sort of disillusioned with our political system that they check out essentially, and then, once that happens, that's a whole nother chapter of our story. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I'm curious, like, do you have any sort of like a get out the vote sort of like um tips, tricks that you would recommend to those in the audience tonight?
Well, it's both an easy and a complicated question. It's sort of a conundrum in that people have to feel like there's a reason to vote and that the voting is going to make a difference. Oftentimes it is, sometimes it's, some people say the lesser of two evils or the evil of two lessers. But the point is that I think it is, important. It's not all that needs to be done by any means. By any means, oftentimes in our culture, we've been conditioned, have we not, in going through school and taking Problems of Democracy 101 that quote unquote democracy begins and ends with voting instead of thinking of it as one of multiple. Now, that's, I'm sure, not true with people on this call who no doubt are disproportionate activists and understand the importance of being connected and engaged in trying to bring about change through community educating, advocating, and organizing. So, I mean, just in terms of voting, I think it's just important to, acknowledge how far voting can go, the importance of it, but to just be straight up. It's not the only thing that should be done, but it should be a part of your, if you will, democratic, relatively speaking, toolkit. That being one thing. And to do that and to get people to be involved and engaged, nothing beats the trust of speaking to people one on one, particularly your friends, particularly people that you know or people you come into contact with, to be honest, to be sincere, to, say what you don't know, and don't be completely one side or the other because nothing is pure black and white. It isn't. We want to come across that way, particularly people who are running for elections. So integrity is really important. And I think being human and humane and understanding that, these people are not on the other side, what oftentimes we are hearing from the other side being attributed, that they are less than human, the other and the like. And that's just not going to get us very far.
Yeah, and I mean to add to that, if you think that big money has a role to play in elections, well, you know what also has a role to play? Voter turnout, right? I mean, you look
Yeah.
at the June 2025 primaries, the one in which Zoran Mamdani won. NPR reported at the time that slightly less than 30% of Democrats cast ballots in the primary,
Yeah.
according to preliminary data. So 70% of Democrats eligible to vote in the primary didn't show up, right? So
Yeah.
if you think that big money might sway an election or impact an election decisively, whether it's this mayoral race or whether it's a House rep race or a Senate race or a presidential election, the one sort of huge factor that often goes unaddressed is just the number of people who didn't turn out to vote,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that could, I mean, it's a great sort of hypothetical game to play that, oh, what would have happened had so many people, additional people turned out? But we don't have to think about what's happened in the past. There are so many elections coming up. And so I would say that yes, voter sort of education and push to vote shouldn't be just this saturated campaign towards the end of elections, towards the business end of elections, because at that time there's just so much news about the election itself that it can get drowned out. And I think there needs to be more sustained efforts to explain the importance of casting your ballot to people when it's not the business end of election cycles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like engaging with people in between and like not just sort of like in the 3 weeks like leading up to a primary or general election. And sort of like related to that, I think we have one hand, Jeff Turner.
Hi guys. NoKings.org is saying they're going to have, they're organizing over 2,500 events this weekend, and they're talking about millions of people turning out. Any thoughts about how we can leverage that momentum to help move we the people forward?
Well, it's a real good question, Jeff. Thanks for being on. I think, metaphorically, we have to sort of uh, hook ourselves um, to the railroad car, if you will. That is certainly a juggernaut that is occurring with people understanding that we are moving rapidly toward, if not already there, elements of authoritarian rule. And that there's certainly many, many examples of and instances and reasons for opposing those individual acts. But those individual acts are expressions of the lack of a real, true, authentic democracy and how our existing constitution is being exploited and being manipulated, being flagrantly abused, and in instances sometimes just flat out ignored. And that there needs to be, obviously, along the trail of opposing fill in the blank, of which there's many things to oppose, there needs to be some effort and time devoted to proposing, not just opposing, but proposing. And that's where, many things need to be proposed, not just the We the People Amendment. But I think sort of contextualizing, saying, yeah, I mean, we need to be out there and need to join our brothers and sisters on the streets and opposing the rapid movement toward authoritarian rule, but do it in a way that acknowledges the fact that, it's more than this day, it's more than this action, and you know what? It's more than this administration. There are elements of authoritarianism that has taken sort of more of an oligarchical face that was present during the last administration. So maybe not as blatant, maybe not as flagrant, but elements of shutting out us out of the process and making sure that people without money were not having their voices heard, their needs met, and the like. And so it's important to acknowledge those as well and say that, yeah, we need to be out there and we need to oppose what's going on right now and the viciousness of ICE and the like. But on the other hand, we also need to spend at least some time acknowledging that proposing fundamental change, systemic change, is really the only way to bring about the kind of change that's going to create a real authentic democracy for the very first time.
Yeah, and to echo what Greg said there, it's not just a Democrat issue either, right? I mean, you look at issues on which there is large bipartisan support among voters, but a consensus on the opposite side among lawmakers. You look at healthcare reform, right? We know there are tons and tons of surveys out there showing that healthcare reform is something that both Democratic voters and Republican voters want, but is something that Democratic lawmakers, well funded Democratic lawmakers, and well funded Republican lawmakers are opposed to, right? Whether it's big pharma, whether it's even gun control, there are instances where there is
Oh, yeah.
greater bipartisan consensus among the people and a bipartisan consensus among the lawmakers in the opposite direction, right? And so I would say that this issue of assessing, analyzing, and speaking up about the impact of big money affects us, like Greg said, far beyond this current Trump administration and on a host of issues on which top lawmakers from both sides of the aisle are actually on the same page.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. We had another question, and then Alfonso, I saw your message to the group and inviting Stephen to share the information that you shared in the chat with the room. Do you feel comfortable doing that, Stephen?
Uh, yes, I would be, and um, I'm in District 9 or Congressional District 9 in Illinois, and I'm with a nonprofit called the American Monetary Institute, and we're trying to promote better money and banking practices around the world and in the United States for the very reasons that you're discussing here tonight. And while we've been specialists in the past focusing on money and banking, we need as our organization to really spread out and connect with all of the other monetary issues, money issues facing people. And we need to create a movement together. So in District 9, there's 21 candidates trying to replace Jan Schakowsky, a long-term liberal Democrat in Congress, who has not supported move to amend, by the way, nor was Mike Quigley in Illinois, which bothers me too. They should have been right there for move to amend. What I'm trying to find is some other small nonprofits oriented in our direction towards climate, move to amend, et cetera, and invite them to a town hall meeting where we get a space, we get them in, and we have a number of people who can be real campaigners when it comes to working for them if we get the right person. And we should hear them out and then make some choices and see if we can really rally and win somebody over. And then they can be, maybe we'll get somewhere we can be doing the great things in New York City, who they might be able to elect. And but we need this for Congress. We need it all up and down the line. So, and I learned a lot tonight, and I feel emboldened and strengthened by you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you for what you've shared. And if there are any resources that you'd like us to share with the folks who
I
registered for
think
the
you're
call.
muted, Kyle.
Oops, can you
Or
hear
I
me?
couldn't hear you. Maybe that's just,
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
sorry,
Sorry.
it's me.
No, sorry about that. No, I was saying that if there are any resources that you'd like to share with respect to what you mentioned with people on the call today, just do send those to us and we'll make sure to get those out to those who registered. I got another question in the chat, but I think it was a direct message to me, so I'll read it out. I think this is probably more geared towards Meghnad, but we have a participant who is asking, given your experience reporting in both India and the US, do you see any sort of like fundamental differences with respect to campaign finance laws in India or the US? Is one country doing something better than the other, or are India and the US both in the same boat, like when it comes to money and politics?
Well, there are some commonalities and some sharp differences. I mean, and both countries now in the throes of authoritarianism too, with Narendra Modi in India and Donald Trump in the United States. The commonality is that big money plays a completely outsized role in elections, both in the United States and in India. The one major huge difference is that in India, a lot of that money is actually unaccounted for. So the official campaign expenses do not record the lion's share, the overwhelming majority of the actual money that's spent on elections. So you can have millions and billions of rupees spent, Indian rupees spent in the election, but only a very small fraction of it will show up in the official disclosures. Because the amount that each candidate can spend is a certain amount, many multiples of which is actually spent in the election, and the outside expenditures are very poorly disclosed. They're barely disclosed at all. So the amount of dark money, if you will, is so much greater in an Indian election that it has a huge impact on how much voters can hear about and see candidates from one party as opposed to candidates from other parties. In the US too, dark money, I mean, we didn't talk as much about it today, but in the US too, there's a lot of unaccounted money that is spent in elections. And that is its own sort of separate ball game of problems. But yeah, to answer that question, in terms of similarities, the one thing that we should be grateful for in the United States is relatively robust disclosure mechanism. So even the New York Campaign Finance Board that I showed you, you go and you can see every single ad that is on your airwaves listed by who's paid for it. If you click on the group that's paid for it, you'll be able to find the details, who is on that group, who's funding that group, etc. So we want more disclosures, obviously, but at least it's comparatively better to what we have in India.
Thank you for sharing that. I guess, like, related to that, is there any country that you know of or any model that's cracked the cheat code when it comes to campaign finance laws? Is there anyone that we can look to abroad who has a system that's sort of like bridges the many gaps that sound like exist in America and in Indian electoral finance law?
Greg, would you like to take that?
Oh, there's a lot of European countries that have limitations on what can be spent. And of course, related to that are election seasons. When you have a situation where money equals free speech, it becomes impossible to, sort of limit what can be deemed a campaign season. But when you have other countries that have snap elections or parliamentary systems where you have a defined season that can be just a couple of months, by definition, that's going to limit the amount of money that's going to be spent. And when you have on top of that actual limits, this country, for example, is unique in giving corporations the right, so to speak, to donate or invest in elections and have limitations on what can be spent by, wealthy individual or any individual. So it's very different.
Yeah, and it's a mixed bag of countries out there, honestly. I mean, there are countries that have limits on everything from contributions to spending. So based on, I think this was valid from a few years ago. I don't know if some of these countries have changed. But all limit nations, as they're called, include Belgium, Canada, Chile, France, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Israel, Japan, South Korea, Poland, Slovenia. Again, this is a list from a few years ago. But these are countries where there are limits both on contributions and on spending. Then you have countries with limits on spending, but not on donations. So you have Austria, Hungary, Italy, New Zealand, the United Kingdom among them. And finally, you have nations with contribution limits, but no spending limits. So how much a single person can contribute has a limit, but how many people can contribute or how much that total pool available to a candidate is does not have a limit. So no spending limits. You have Finland, and of course you have the United States, but in the United States too, the super PACs do not have contribution limits either. So the US in many ways is in that sort of um, hall of notoriety for when it comes to campaign finance with very weak limitations and restrictions, if at all, on how much money is actually spent on an election cycle.
Yeah. And the hits just keep on coming as well, because there's now an effort before the courts, a suit filed by J.D. Vance when he was senator, that's going to be heard this session in the Supreme Court that would reduce limits of what can be contributed. I think to political parties, is it something like that? So if I can just have a second to go back to the question from Steve Walsh, who, Steve, you inferred, maybe trying to organize a town hall meeting. And that is one way, certainly, to get candidates running for office. In an effective way, in my previous job, I worked for a Quaker-related organization, and we, leading up to elections, would oftentimes have town halls. And the way we did it effectively, anyway, is you try to contact a couple of other organizations and get them to buy in. And what that buy-in means is if the 3 or 4 organizations are willing to jointly sponsor a town hall, then you have a representative from each of those organizations that serve on the panel. And that panel collectively then comes up with the questions to be asked. And so then it gives out every organization sort of fingerprints of them being involved in the planning and, of course, then in the publicizing of that. And knowing that candidates are more likely to turn out when they know that there's going to be an audience there, and the chances of there being an audience is enhanced when you have 3 or 4 or 5 organizations that are combined and collectively co-sponsoring the event.
Thank you, Greg. Good information. That's from your mouth to my ears. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcia, I see your hand.
Hi, my apologies for being so late. I had another commitment. I wasn't sure I was even going to make it. But along this line of getting together, organizing with other groups, last week I went to a town hall with Amy Acton, who is running for the governor of Ohio. And apparently, so they say, statistically tied right now with Vivek Ramaswamy. And I was able to ask a question and voice some information about move to amend its goals and everything. And she was very supportive vocally, and the audience seemed very, very supportive. I mean, they clapped a couple of times and everything. And I had talked with Greg before, and afterwards I went to get her to pledge to be supportive of Move to Amend should she win the election. There was a huge line. She was posing with people for photographs, but I was able to track her aide down, and he said that he would get her the papers, etc. So I've not heard a response yet, and I have emailed back twice, asking about whether or not she was going to do that, as she said when she was speaking to the group. But my thought too is that I was able to identify one other group that I was familiar with. I think that would be an extremely effective way, because there were probably close to 100 people there, and they were really enthusiastic, when I was speaking about Move to Amend. And, I was thinking, boy, to be able to get together with like-minded people, in that type of a format would probably be a really good thing to do. We'll see if she, if she does sign a pledge. She, said she would, and it's a week, but I know she's, really busy. But that was just a thought and comment I had about that tactic.
Well, thanks, Marcia. I'll tell you, if there is any race in the country where money in elections should be brought up between candidates, relatively speaking, of Amy Acton, who's, sort of hand in mouth raising money, versus Vivek, who's what, a billionaire? So, yeah,
Yeah,
be a
I
good
know.
issue,
So
good issue to raise.
when she said that, I was thinking, okay, so if you're tied and we know he's a billionaire, where are you getting all your money from? So, but I didn't say that. Maybe I should have.
I mean, but there's an argument to be made there, right? Can candidates who are truly opposed to this say, "Hey, I'm not going to take any super PAC money. The super PACs are going to bankroll those opposed to my candidature in far greater amounts, and the paltry sum that I'll get from these super PACs isn't worth it." And therefore, I'm going to take a principled stand against super PACs in politics themselves, right? So there's a point to be made there. You're going to have, I mean, those candidates will have to forego a certain percentage of funds that would otherwise benefit their campaign. But maybe it's a risk worth taking in making voters more aware about the impact that big money has on elections. That, hey, I'm not going to take this money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so my outreach will be more organic, will be based on the funds that my campaign has raised legally, and therefore, if the other person wants to get money from all kinds of special interests, let them do that. But this campaign won't do that. So if you see more campaigns coming forward, more candidates coming forward and taking that bold, risky gamble, maybe it pays off, maybe it doesn't in
Yeah.
individual races, but on the larger issue of advocacy against the impact of big money on politics, it might be worthwhile.
There
I'm
has been
so
a campaign. There has been a campaign to try to get candidates not to accept corporate PAC
Yeah.
money.
I'm so glad you said that, because she did allude to that, she was fundamentally opposed to that, but to stay in the game, she didn't come right out and say that she was accepting PAC money, but that's what she was implying. I'm pretty sure. So when she said that, I thought, are you going to sign this? We'll see. I'll keep you posted.
Thanks, Marcia.
It sounds like part of the solution might be making it costly to take big money. And with that terrible pun, if there are no more questions, it looks like, are we cleared in the chat, Alfonso? Okay.
Yes.
Well, if there are no more questions, again, I just want to thank our esteemed panelists, Greg Coleridge, Megnan Bose, Alfonso Antec. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. Thank you to each and every person in this audience. I think this is a conversation that we all need to take forward, not just tonight, but tomorrow and in the years to come, because this is going to be a long-term slog. This is not a sort of one election cycle and it's fixed problem. Money in politics has been a problem for a long time in America, as we've seen, and it's going to take a while to ameliorate what's been done. So it's really incumbent on all of us who have been equipped with knowledge and statistics and a framework for understanding why this matters to take this forward into our communities, our lives, our work, like wherever it is. Let's just keep the conversation going. Let's educate people who couldn't be here tonight, who've never heard of these topics, and essentially like get them to understand why this matters for not just their ability to exercise their right to vote, but for their vote to mean anything, for their quality of life, right? In a governing class that's not responsive to the needs or wishes of the electorate is it's I don't think it's the kind of country that we want to live in. It's not the kind of country where I would argue most of us on this call would do particularly well. So, if this is something that has inspired you, take that forward, take this knowledge forward, and keep spreading the knowledge. We are the ones who set each other free, as it were, who set ourselves free. So, on that note, thank you all so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure. My name is Kylie Madov, and this has been a Move to Amend webinar. Thank you all so much.
Corporations are not